Hello, my name is Dr. Catherine Moore McCallan, and I'm the director of the UTRGV Center for Latin American Arts. And we are honored to have a painting lecture and workshop today by Daisy Patton, hosted in Professor Gina Palacios' class at the UTRGV School of Art in Brownsville in the Rustenburg Gallery and Rustenburg building. Thank you all for joining us today from UTRGV Edinburgh, Brownsville, and all over the nation. We're honored to have Daisy here today, and we're extremely excited to have her beautiful painting in the Uncovered Spaces exhibition in McAllen at the IMAS Museum. So anyone who has not gone to see the exhibition, please go visit at the International Museum of Art and Science in McAllen. And we're excited to have time to visit with Daisy Patton today. Daisy is a multidisciplinary artist who was born in Los Angeles. Her mother is from the American South, and her father is from Iran, who she never met. And Daisy spent her childhood between California and Oklahoma, deeply affected by these contrasting cultural ways of being. Daisy's been influenced by collective and political histories, as well as memory and the fallibility of the body. Her work explores the meaning and social convention of families, relationships, connections, storytelling, and story carrying. And Daisy currently resides in Western Massachusetts, and she is exhibited in solo and group shows nationally, including a solo show at the CU Art Museum at the University of Colorado, the Chautauqua Institution in New York, the Katonah Museum of Art, the Fulginitti Pavilion at the Center for Bioethics at the Anschutz Medical Campus, among others. She has paintings held in public and private collections, such as the Denver Art Museum, the Fidelity Investments Art Collection, and Delta Airlines collection. And Daisy's work has been featured in publications such as Hyperallergic, the Jealous Curator, Transition Magazine, the Denver Post, the Chautauquan Daily, the Seattle Met, and more. And Minerva Projects Press has published Broken Time Machines, Daisy Patton, a monograph book with essays and poetry on Patton's practice from spring 2021. And Patton has completed artist residencies at Minerva Projects, Anderson Ranch, the studios at Mass Mocha, Redline Denver, and Eastside International in LA. And she's been awarded the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund Grant, as well as the Assets for Artists Massachusetts Matched Savings Grant, and the Montage Travel Award from SMFA for research in Dresden, Germany. Daisy earned an MFA from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is also affiliated with Tufts University. And it's a multidisciplinary program. And she also received her BFA in Studio Arts from the University of Oklahoma with minors in history and art history and an honors degree. K Contemporary Gallery represents Patton in Denver, Colorado, and J Reinhardt Gallery represents her in Seattle. And Daisy's website is daisypatton.com, and her Instagram is at @Daisy_Patton. And I encourage you to follow her. She has amazing Instagram. It's very dynamic. And we're excited to introduce Daisy today, and the Center for Latin American Arts, in conjunction with the School of Art and Design at UTRGV, is honored to have you here today, Daisy. And thank you for spending this time with our students. And please join me in welcoming Daisy Patton.
Thank you so much for that lovely intro, and thank you so much for having me. This exhibition is really incredible with so many fantastic artists. And I'm incredibly grateful and honored to be visiting you all here today. So I'm going to sort of give a brief overview of my overall practice and really focus in on the body of work that is featured at the museum, which is the Forgetting Is So Long series. I have a lot of bodies of work that I am working on at the same time, and sort of give a little bit of background of what led to that. I will also be sort of breaking this conversation up a little bit in that I'm going to have a series of questions that I would like you, the audience, to consider and sort of free write with as a means of thinking about artwork. So for me, in terms of like a painting workshop, I find that the most productive thing is actually thinking through things rather than necessarily doing. And I will say that a lot of my process is very, very time consuming, which is why also there would not be time for that during today's visit and conversation. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just so you can see. I have some work behind me, and I will take you on a little tour of my studio a little bit later during this conversation and get a little bit closer to some of the work that's in progress here. But to show you some finished work, we're going to do that real fast. And like I said, I'm going to focus solely on, oh, okay, no, I'm not going to do that. Aha, here we go. So here's hoping Zoom is going to cooperate with me today. So as Catherine mentioned, I am from Los Angeles. My mother is from Arkansas in the American South, and my father is from Iran. I never met him, and I still don't know his name. And that sort of absence has been a lingering ghost throughout my life in a variety of ways that it has manifested. And so I moved back and forth in my childhood between California and Oklahoma, and ended up doing my BFA at the University of Oklahoma. And when I began there, I focused on painting and was really interested in, I've always been very interested in other people. And during this period of time, as a younger artist, I was very focused on relationships of power and control, probably because those were things I felt like I very much lacked. And so it's very sort of voyeuristic in how I was interested in other people. That continued. So about maybe a year before I was going to graduate, I hit a painting block that lasted for 8 years and ended up shifting into photography. And so I found photo theory to be something that was very aligned with my ways of thinking in terms of what a photograph represented, the sort of voyeurism, being able to, you know, a lot of the stuff really was appealing to me. And so I was very influenced by photographers like Nan Golden and Robert Frank, and then also more multidisciplinary artists like Sophie Cao. And I took that work into graduate school at SMFA/Tufts during that period of time. They were not linked, now they are. I mean, they were linked, but not the same. It's complicated, it's fine. In any case. So while there, I was still working on photo, and then about halfway through the program, I was hospitalized and diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And that was a profound shift in not just my life, but also my art practice. So my work shifted from something super confrontational, because I was going out in public taking pictures of people and with a camera, to something that was a little bit more based in a different kind of connection. It's still sometimes forced relationship, but like in a more gentle way, I guess you could say. And I ended up leaving SMFA with sound installation. I did a series on children of absent fathers talking about their memories and experiences. That series is called I'm Perfectly Fine Without You, which is still an ongoing body of work. You can find that on iTunes to download as a podcast. Some of them are very intense, to be warned. And then I decided I finally was able to go back into painting, and photography was sort of that bridge into returning to painting. So I knew I couldn't make the the sound project because I knew what sort of questions I would ask myself, and that was kind of pointless. So I ended up painting my own family photographs. I actually think I have them on here. Aha, I do. Okay, so this is just sort of an example of that work. They were all very small, realistic paintings. So they were all family photo sized essentially. So this piece is 4 inches by 4 inches. This piece, I think it's 10 by 10. I can't quite see because the label is covered. And I would insert a father's presence. And so I was really interested in thinking about this sort of alternate timeline or reality of what it would have been like if he had been present in my life. Time is something I've always been very interested in. And for me, time is not a linear thing. But this is the kind of painting I actually find tremendously frustrating to do. My BFA work and my heart as a painter is a little bit more expressive rather than sort of restrictive pieces. So these would take about a month to do, and they were very small. And so to return back to the meat of today, in March of 2014, so just a little over 8 years ago, what is time? I was sort of in this strange in-between space. So I was dealing with some familial complications and was feeling a little unmoored, and was also sort of frustrated with that other body of work, the Reconstructed Family Reunion series. And I was at the time still living in Boulder and went up to Denver and to see art, and wandered into a boutique, and there was a pile of abandoned family photographs for sale in this box. And I remember having this sort of kinship of feeling that sort of abandonment and feeling that sort of discard, and was really drawn to them. I didn't know exactly what the work would be. And then I took some of them home with my photo background. I knew about printing and did a little bit of research online to figure out how I could mount the print onto a panel. And then without necessarily having a conceptual outline already lined up, I just started sort of painting. And so this piece here, Blondie, is the second painting in the series. And I immediately knew that it was something that was working for me. So this body of work, Forgetting Is So Long, like I said, is absolutely this sort of combination of photography and painting. It's where I'm taking abandoned or discarded family photographs that I source from all over the world. And I can talk about that sourcing in a moment. I'm enlarging it to life size, the photograph, and then painting over it with oil paint. So for me, it's very much about memory, identity, loss, and also the sort of in-between space. There are a few things that I like to talk about with regards to this series. So one of them is thinking about the way that the sort of symbolism of a photograph versus a painting and how it sort of deals with time. So in photography, it's a representation of a moment, a very specific split second as the camera shutter closes. And so, Roland Barthes talks about it as a moment of death. So it's death of a moment. It can also be as time elapses that the people that are within the photograph are no longer with us. And, so thinking about it as this very static, specific moment in time versus something like painting where time kind of bends or shifts or changes. It's dynamic. It doesn't follow any sort of rules. It can be cyclical. It can be anything other than linear. And so I'm using painting as a way of disrupting and in sort of collapsing space and time to bring the people that are within the photograph to us, to the present moment, hence the life size. I want you as the audience to have this sort of one-to-one connection with the people. So as you can see, they're painted with really bright, fantastical colors, and then there's patterning. And there are a few things that I'm thinking about with those aspects. One is sort of this idea of there's an anthropologist named Michael Taussig who talks about defacement, and specifically thinking about how the defacement of sacred objects sort of shocks them back into being. And this is an example I really need to try and shift, but an easy way of thinking of that is if you're in a park or somewhere and there's a statue or a monument, you don't really notice it until it's maybe vandalized or missing or shifted in some way, in which case all of a sudden you notice it again and pay attention. And so thinking about the family photograph as an object, thinking about it as a sacred object, and how painting over it, instead of just it being this sort of act of violence, it's actually this loving act of remembrance for me. So I work in sort of series within series with the Forgetting series, because I have about 5,000 or so photos in my collection. I do collect and hold on to those photographs. And so this particular body of work I'm showing right now is based on the funerary images that I collect. And this was the show that Catherine had mentioned at the CU Art Museum. So this is an install shot. So this body of work specifically focused on funerary images. And my intention was that the audience would be sort of serving as the mourners attending. The funerary images, I know we are in this moment of mass death, thinking about how they are this sort of hyper representation of this overall body of work, that these photographs are objects of devotion to the deceased. They are the last portrait of the deceased. And these lush florals are a signification of mortality. So part of the reason that I work with floral patterns specifically in the work, so in addition to these sort of bright fantastical colors that are not like natural colors, but sort of are outside of that, it's a way of sort of nodding to the otherworldliness or the sort of fantastical space that the people are in. The floral patterns are another sort of element in this sort of toolkit of defacement. So the pattern does a few things for me in the work. It can underline relationships and connections. It can sort of shift a vernacular photo, a casual photographs, maybe sort of slight off aspect of a composition. It can also be the sort of adornment or embellishment that is part of each of the images. The other thing that I'm thinking about too is that flowers traditionally in still lifes are this sort of hint at mortality. So a lot of Western still life, art history still lifes, you'll see a flower with a petal that's dropping, and that's supposed to not be a nod to the brevity of our lives. But in my paintings, the flowers are forever blooming and are forever present. So as you can see, they are all very large scale works. I am very interested in painting in terms of like the language of painting, in terms of trying to push the image. And it's a very sort of individual process on how I work with each individual photograph. So oftentimes what will happen is I will have a photo that I'm working with, and one color may come forward, and then I'll build a color scheme around that. So in this case, it was this really bright ultramarine blue, and then built the color scheme around that. And so color is something that's very important to me. I don't think of color individually in terms of like traditional symbolism, but rather as an overall sort of sense or a mood that it evokes. So I'm thinking about how a color scheme will set that sort of emotional content. I can sort of talk a little bit about audience interactions and stuff, but I may wait until after our sort of free writing moment. So I'm thinking a lot about living memory, and maybe this is a good time actually to break into that. So I'm going to show you a couple of more images of from the series overall, and then I'm going to jump out of it, and I hope that you all have pencils or a writing instrument of some kind. It can also be a computer, and some paper on hand. And we're going to do a little bit of co-thinking together, if you will. So this is just some of my more recent work. I'm going to finish showing a few of these, and then I will jump back in again. So one of the things that I really think about with this body of work and just my overall practice is really focused in history and memory. So I have a couple of bodies of work that are focused on reproductive justice around abortion and forced sterilization, two sides of the same coin of reproductive oppression. And then, and this is the painting, by the way, that is at the exhibition. Let's see, I think I have, oh, I don't. Okay, so this painting is 8 feet tall by 80 inches. And this photo is a little bit more personal for me. It is a photo that was sourced in New York. It is from Iran. Iranian photos in particular, very precious to me, are very hard to get a hold of, and ones I very much treasure. I've been working on a series around the family portrait, which is what some of these recent paintings are on, for an exhibition that I'll be doing in November with my gallery, K Contemporary. So I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go. Wonderful. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in thinking about who do we remember and why? Who gets to be held in collective memory and living memory? The way that I think about living memory is that for those that we still remember, they're still alive in some way, as long as there's someone here that can still remember them. And so for me, the Forgetting series is very much a sort of radical act of remembrance. So even though I don't necessarily have access to the memories and information that's embedded in the photograph, because I'm missing the necessary translators, I'm missing the people who once owned these photographs and knew who these people were, who touched and held this piece of paper. So there is this sort of dislocation of me not quite knowing who the people are, but still in some ways trying to honor and remember them. And so thinking about this idea of who do we remember and why, I'd like you all to consider for the next few minutes, and this is the sort of writing exercise portion, to sort of answer that question for yourself. And what does that mean to you? And it can be anything, you can think as expansively as you want and as widely as you want in terms of what does that aspect of memory and what importance means to you. So for the next few minutes, if you could just write down, and I should note, all of this writing is for yourself. You don't have to worry about being put on the spot and sharing. None of that's going to happen. So you can write it as freely as you would like. So I'm going to mute myself while you all do that. I'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes. Does that sound reasonable? And then we'll jump back in. I'll have extra questions for you.
Daisy, can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. So the question that I ask myself is, who do we remember and why? So I'd like you to answer that question for yourselves. What does that look like for you? And it could be something extremely personal. It can be something that is maybe more politically engaged or socially engaged. It can be whatever it is that that question sort of makes you think of. And fair warning, I will have follow-up questions, so do leave some space. Okay. So with the writing that you've done, is there something personal in your answers or the things that you wrote about? Is there attachment or connection that's inherent to how you answered that question? And these are things that you don't necessarily have to respond to, but more of just think about and sort of notice about how it is that you responded to that initial prompt. Okay. So with that in mind, I'd now like you to spend some time sort of visualizing and writing about objects that you associate with what it is that you wrote about for that initial question. You can do it as a list. You can write out a list of objects. You can write something a little bit more, put together as like sentences, however it makes sense to you. And those objects can be something that's ephemeral. So it can be something like smells, for example, or something that is not like a permanent object, if that makes sense. These sort of objects that you're associating with how it is that you choose to remember and why are meant to sort of guide you towards a kind of art making. So if you will spend the next, let's say 3 minutes, I don't know if I'm giving you enough time or not. So if you need more time, that's extremely okay. But let's go with 3 minutes for now of different kinds of objects and materials that you associate with how you answered that first question. All right, great. Okay, we will continue on. Wonderful, perfect. Thumbs up is good. So the reason why I asked those questions is as I sort of went through sort of talking about the start of this body of work, is that for me, those questions I interpreted in the way that I did. And the object that I was associating with was a family photograph, and thinking about, that though while I am at heart a painter, and I would say predominantly my medium of choice is painting, I also work in embroidery and fiber art, as well as photography and sound and all of these other media. So the way that I think about art making is very much based in what it is that I'm thinking about, what is the concept that I'm working with, like the idea for a body of work, and then what makes the most sense as far as like how to bring that body of work to fruition. And so this is where, sitting down and writing sometimes can help unblock those kinds of things, and also realize that just because you're maybe working in painting doesn't mean that you can't bring in other objects. You can create installations with the painting. There's such a vast way of art making that is not limited to just one specific thing. So hopefully some of that writing helped lead you to think about a different kind of art making. In terms of my body of work, and I will zoom us through my actual studio here in a hot minute. In terms of talking about the object itself, the photographs that I'm collecting. So as I mentioned, I have a little over 5,000 photographs that I've been collecting since March of 2014. And those photographs come from all over the world. I'm sourcing them through eBay, thrift stores, antique shops. Sometimes people gift them to me. And to me, they're very precious objects. So I had actually wanted to be a history professor when I was younger, because I thought you couldn't make a living as an artist. And so I thought a history professor would be the way to pay the bills, which is hilarious because you can't get a job as a history professor either anymore. Funny how that works. So to me, they are these like historical documents in a way. And so I preserve the originals. I'm not cutting them up. I'm not destroying them directly. I'm scanning them and then working with the photo prints. I know that a lot of artists work with these kinds of found objects and then alter them themselves. And that's other people's work. That's what you can do. For me personally, I sort of keep them in this sort of collection. And so there's often something about each photograph that made me choose to collect it. Roland Barthes talks about a photograph in the aspect of something that pierces him. He calls it punctum. So something that pierces him when he looks at the photo. And it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody's face. It can be a gesture or an object or a piece of clothing or something that's within the image that made him sort of pay attention. And that's certainly the case for me in terms of how I'm collecting. I'm thinking also about how photography over the course of its history. So first of all, I should say that to me, photo and painting are very much intertwined. I often call them dysfunctional siblings because they're constantly calling each other dead. So, in terms of photography, early photo history very much copied the tropes of painting in terms of pose, etc. And, now I can't think of any painters that aren't using some sort of photography as reference material to paint with. So they're very much interlinked. I also think about the portrait in a family photograph and how it is this like really static moment. Like I said, it's like very specific. When the shutter closed, this is the moment that you see. So it's a very exact image. You'll see all of the details and everything, but sometimes you're missing some of the additional aspects, like maybe personality or something like that, which painted portraits were maybe less specific and less exact in terms of how they are created, but have this sort of idea of likeness of the person. So you kind of see a gesture or a sense of self within the painting. And so to me, the way that I'm painting is sort of bringing likeness back into the photograph, back into the portrait. And then, the other thing, and this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about audience, after now that you've done this sort of free writing and sort of thought about what these questions mean to you. So I think it's really important. These works are not completed until there is an audience that can come and be in their presence and sort of have this sort of emotional or spiritual connection with the person. And these are the things that I've been told by other people. So, there's a wide range of reactions to the work. I've had some people who have been really overwhelmed, maybe cried. I've had some people who've gotten angry, others who think they're funny. I am an artist who believes that the artists themselves are not necessarily the authority on their own work. I like to leave an open space for audience members. I think it's really important. I think art is communication. It's often a visual format, not always. And, it is sort of reaching across, asking for someone to link hands in a way. And, for me, these paintings are a few things. First, they're these sort of altars to the deceased people that are within the image themselves. They're also portals. They transport us somewhere else. They transport the people to us. There is this sort of fracturing of time that's happening. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there are these spaces of connection. So, what I've noticed has happened is that initially people view my work and they see the people in front of them and they think about that person. And then they start to think about how that person, regardless of whether or not they look like the individual they're thinking of, but it sort of reminds them of someone else that they know, whether that be a family member or a friend or someone who's very dear to them. And then there's this sort of web of connection, of this back and forth between the painting and the person that I hope in some way sort of deepens their, you know, aspects of connection and humanity of this sort of back and forth, and the sort of recognition that we're all sort of connected in different ways. I think that for so many people, there's all these categories and boxes that different people are placed into, whether through identity or, you know, in terms of like the past. We think of past people as this sort of box and they're separate from us. But to me, when I look at a photograph, I see them and I see that they are me, and I and them, we're back and forth. The only thing that's separating us is time. And, you know, the more that you study history, you realize very regrettably that so often they're not that dissimilar to how we are today, in different ways. And so I think that helps collapse this sort of sense of nostalgia, this sort of like fake sentimentality that gets placed on the past, that somehow the past was better. One of the books that was really influential for me when I was an undergrad was a book called Wisconsin Death Trip. And it's by Michael Lessie. It is a book that he created in the 70s when he was a graduate student. And basically he went through a newspaper archive in a small Wisconsin town. And I believe it was, I want to say it was like, it's either 1880 to 1890 or 1890 to 1900. It's a decade's worth of time. And he pulled out, instead of like sort of the positive things that are happening in this town, he pulled out all of the sort of the death, destruction, and chaos. And for each chapter is broken into the year. And he also included photographs from the newspaper archive that over the course of the book, he starts, instead of just showing the photograph by itself, he starts to collage the images. And so there's a sort of crescendo by the end of the book. And I think what was really interesting is it really does sort of make you understand both what it was like to be in this small town during this period of time, and then also how not terribly dissimilar it is to a lot of what's happening with us today. So that's kind of an overall sort of explanation of the Forgetting series. So I will give you a little peek at my studio. I should say that the studio is not long for this world, because I am moving and having a new studio built, which I'm very excited about because the studio is far too small for me. So I'm going to show you some of the work that I'm doing, and then I'm going to open up to questions. So this is the painting that was behind me. This photograph was sourced from Puerto Rico. And so this is part of the family portrait show, which I am currently titling Like Two Drops of Water, Like Oil and Vinegar, which is supposed to sort of represent the complicated relationships we have with family. So it's not done. I still have to do more in the patterning. I have to include the flowers and stuff, but you can kind of get a little bit of a close-up view. You can see sort of the texture and what it is that I like to do. And like I said, these are, to me, painting is an interactive experience. I want you to be able to get close and see different things. You know, in the way back when, before photography, before media, paintings were kind of like this sort of sense of entertainment, this TV where you would spend time looking at a painting and different things would sort of pop up as you looked. And so that's kind of how I like to think about how I paint. These are small little pieces that are experiments. So as you can see, they are not life-size. As a painter, you're going to make bad paintings. You have to make bad paintings. And it's better to make bad paintings that are small instead of big. So that is my philosophy on that. And then this is the other portrait. A little bit. So this one is in progress. I'm adding birds to the pattern, which you can see here. And there we go. Color always tilted. You can see that this portion here, this background, has a lot of texture, and then into the washes that sort of left artifacts afterwards. And then I have a piece that is completed, that is here. It is my first tintype photograph that I've gotten to work with. So tintypes are photographs that, instead of being printed on paper, are developed onto actual pieces of tin instead of metal. So you can see how different the texture is on the photograph itself. And then, as another little sort of sneak peek bonus, while I'm waiting over the summer for my studio to be built, I have been collecting a lot of old mirrors and windows, and I'm thinking a lot about the language that I'm working with, and I want to kind of like expand that a little bit. So these are some objects I've been collecting that are going to be experiments. So I have no idea what it's going to look. I mean, I do have an idea of what it's going to look like, but I don't know how it's going to go. So that's kind of a brief little peek out. And to explain why my studio is so tight, you'll see that I've got some paintings here. And then, let's see. I can't quite go back there with you, but I'll tilt the camera around. So that is my storage right now. It's a little cramped. That is the one thing about being an artist who makes objects instead of an artist who does experiences or video or whatever else. Storage is absolutely a problem. So thank you so much for listening to all of that. And I would love to hear if you have any questions. I know we've gone the full, well, we started a little bit late. I am more than happy to stay as long as there are questions, so don't feel shy if you have any. And those questions don't have to be limited to this body of work. It could also be other questions like career questions or other things that you may be thinking about. So thank you very much.
Yes, there's Kathy. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, no, thank you, Daisy and Carlos. I agree. I think it'd be best for you to read the questions because you have access to them.
Mm-hmm. So Kathy, you said is asking or commenting, I love Daisy's work. I'm interested in knowing why Daisy doesn't include in her title cards the specific place, person where she obtained the photos. Example, business or garage sale or street, etc. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So I should say that for a very long time, I didn't even include the information of where the images were sourced. I was a little concerned that audience members may see a location and then bring stereotypes or ideas about a place or a people to the work before actually spending time with the work. But then I realized that people were doing that anyway, and sort of flattening out the people that they saw. So they would look at a specific image and assume that it was of a certain group of people, and it wasn't. So that's why I started to include location. As far as how I'm sourcing them and stuff like that, you know, I've been collecting for 8 years. I have a pretty decent memory of some of it, but I've forgotten other parts. I try to keep that information as part of my digital, my hard drive that I keep all of the images in. I'm trying to code that all in, but I don't have it for everything. The other thing is that it's why I specify sourced in, sourced from, rather than this photograph is from this specific location. So for example, the painting that is at the show at the museum is specified as being sourced from New York, but is from Iran. And so making that sort of clarification. I don't know if I think it's necessary to know how exactly, like what vendor I might have gotten it from. To me, it's more of a place that I think is more resonant for folks. So yeah.
So that's the question I have on my end. I'm not sure. I don't know if in Brownsville they have a question in the studio.
Yes, we do have a question. Hold on one second.
Can I just say it?
Mhm.
Okay. I was wondering, when selecting photos, sometimes we have like a professor here who always says that like Italians and Hispanics are similar in family, like traditions and cultures. Do you kind of base that off when selecting family photos from different cultures, like the Puerto Rican photo, or like the Iranian ones? Like, I don't know how to explain it. Do you like choose your photos based on like cultures that may be similar to one another in terms of traditions or like family dynamics? I guess that's a better way of wording it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, actually. Thank you for asking that. So that is partially why I started to put the location, because people were very much flattening the folks that they were seeing in the image and making assumptions based on that. I think there's something really interesting about the fact that, you know, much with like the history of Patton, the history of Patton is one that is full of cultural exchange, where, like, for example, Paisley started out as this Indian pattern, a Bodhi flower, and then ended up in Paisley, Scotland, and became sort of, you know, it over a course of time sort of got translated back and forth. I think that there's something really interesting about these sort of cultural exchanges, but I am very mindful of not wanting to erase the specificity of culture within the image themselves. And when I'm making patterns, I try really hard to not necessarily, you know, like, for example, a lot of the patterns that I'm creating are patterns that I've created myself, either, you know, looking at flowers or nature that I come across in nature hikes, and then sort of convert into this more stylized form. Or, you know, I might come across another kind of pattern and sort of break it up and sort of rewild it in a way. So like taking it away from its really like rigid way of being into where it's like it's more wild, you know, going across the thing. So I think it's really interesting when people make those kind of connections back and forth and start to realize, and, you know, certainly when I'm working with a photograph, I'll sometimes think about that as I'm working, that sometimes the families remind me of other people that I know, or, you know, there are these sort of personal connections. But I try not to tell people too much about that, because I do, like I said, I want to leave it open for the viewer to come and make their own connections to the works. But I think that answers the question. Thank you for it. And if it doesn't, please tell me and I will continue to respond to it.
Another question from Kathy is, do you use image transfer to transfer the photos to the canvas or fabric?
Yes. So a process question. So the way that I work, so first of all, I should say there are so many different ways that you can take a photographic image and transfer it onto whatever material it is that you're working with. And that can be anything. I mean, it can be fabric. You can transfer images to fabric. You can either through printing or, you know, printmaking, where you're actually having ink go across the like canvas, for example. You can do gel medium transfers, where you're taking a photographic image and gel medium, and then you can look this up online. There's so many YouTube videos for this stuff. It's very helpful. And then there are some people who embed the actual physical objects themselves into it, either adhering with like glue or maybe embroidering or stitching the object into a canvas. So all of that to say, there's so many different ways to work with source imagery and embedding it into whatever material it is that you're using. For me, I'm taking actual photo prints. So I have a large format printer that I print all of the images with. And then I used to do this all myself with a small group of people, a couple of other folks. But now I have a fabricator do it because it's just too physically difficult for me to do. And I have the print actually get adhered to panel. So in the past, I used to use gel medium to do that, which is a fairly arduous process. It takes about 48 hours in total, which is why I said we couldn't do that today, because it would not finish. But now I have a fabricator that takes my prints and mounts them to dye bond. And so I outsource that now. But like I said, there's so many different ways that you can do it. There's a piece that I recently saw at the Brooklyn Museum. Oh my gosh, Rafael Lozano, who was taking photographs of, and this piece was very moving. I cried while watching, while viewing it, but is taking images of people who died because of COVID and is creating their portrait with an hourglass. So the sand from an hourglass, and then photographing that portrait. And then the sand is removed and then begins another portrait. And you can actually go onto their website, the Brooklyn Museum, online to see video of that process, as well as some of the images. It's incredible and incredibly moving. And so, you know, when we talk about how can we convert a photographic image into a different medium or art, there's so many different ways to do that. Another body of work that I don't remember the name of the series, but the artist is Oscar Munoz. He is a Colombian artist who was making portraits of the disappeared in Colombia and was using the outside sidewalk during a hot day and would paint the portraits of the disappeared with water onto the sidewalk. And so they're inherently ephemeral. The heat from the sidewalk would start to evaporate the water that was being painted on. And so the same sort of like metaphor of this disappearance and of these lives that are no longer here with us, and this sort of memory. There are videos that you can find of those as well, probably on YouTube, that I think are really beautiful. So like I said, there's so many ways that you can work with photographic material and converting it into different kinds of objects or different kinds of experiences. But that's kind of how I do mine.
Thank you so much, Daisy. This has been amazing. We just really appreciate your time and your expertise and your answers. We are going to continue this event as a one-on-one conversation among Daisy and a few students in Gina Palacios's class. So for this Zoom webinar, we just want to thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Daisy. This has been amazing, and we're so honored you're part of Uncovered Spaces exhibition, open through July 10th here in McAllen at the IMAS.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for your care and attention with my work. I'm deeply appreciative.